Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to get started in a few minutes. We're going to ask all of you as you're joining to, if you feel comfortable, put your names in the chat, where you're coming from, a school or an organization, pronouns, please and welcome. And we're so excited to see all of you. We're just going to wait a few more minutes to let a few more attendees enter the session. Again, welcome everybody. We're going to get started in about 2 minutes. As you enter, feel free to use the chat to share your name, where you're coming from. Oh, thank you. I didn't even say that one. Where you're coming from. If you want to share your org or your school district, pronouns, please feel free to pop those in the chat. We have a good number of people, so I'm just going to get started again. Please feel free to share your name and info and pronouns in the chat. It's so nice to see you all. Good morning. Thank you for spending your time with us. I'm going to let my co-presenters introduce themselves in 1 second, but I am Morgan Craven. I'm the National Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Community Engagement at IDRA. So I support our policy work across the US South. I'm based in Texas, but from Atlanta. Really excited to see all of you this morning and talk about discipline and incorporating restorative practices into your schools and policies. Paige, do you mind introducing yourself?
Not at all. Thanks, Morgan. Hello, everyone. My name's Paige Duggins-Clay. I'm IDRA's Chief Legal Analyst and lead our litigation support, amicus work, and Texas school discipline policy work, and have the privilege of supporting this amazing team. I'm really looking forward to talking about how to incorporate restorative practices in our policies today. And I'll pass it off to Terrence.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Terrence Wilson. I am IDRA's Regional Policy and Community Engagement Director. So I work across our southern region that overlaps with our EAG region to help support folks who are working on education equity and policy and practice. And I'm also an attorney, and I've worked with representing young people and students in disciplinary hearings and special education hearings in the past. So this is an issue that is really close to my heart. I'm really glad we're going to have an opportunity to share with y'all this afternoon and this morning. I guess all morning.
All morning. It's so exciting we get to be together. So just in the way of agenda and what we're hoping you get out of the session, first I'll say please feel free to use the chat. If you have a desire to come off mute and say something, we can definitely give you the power to do that. And we'll have some breakout room time at the end for you all to be able to chat with each other about what we're talking about. But please feel free to share any ideas in the chat, or just let us know that you want to come off mute, and we'll make sure that can happen for you. So as you all know, you're here because we're talking about harmful discipline practices in schools, what they look like, and how we can move away from using harmful discipline practices and explore the transformative results of restorative practices in schools. So we're going to talk about what restorative practices are, what they look like in schools, and how we can incorporate restorative practices into local and state policy. As I mentioned, we're going to spend a few minutes at the end, well, longer than a few minutes, a bit of time at the end in breakout rooms so that you can work through some hypotheticals and discuss how you can incorporate restorative practices in your schools and school districts, and then we'll come back together to chat about some ideas. And really what we're hoping that you'll gain is an understanding of what restorative practices look like, both in policy and practice, so that you can implement them in your schools, in your organizations, in your school districts, and so that you can be really strong advocates for the supportive policies that promote the adoption of this really incredible research-based strategy. So I'm going to start by talking a little bit, just set the stage, what we mean by harmful discipline practices. So when we say harmful discipline, we are talking about doing the things that we know are bad for children, that are harmful for school climates, and it's also not investing the time and resources to train and support folks to do what we know actually works, to support students, make sure we're supporting their learning, their social emotional development, and building those strong school climates that we know we need to have like safe and supportive schools. And again, I ask you to engage in the chat specifically around the question, what does discipline look like in your schools, in your school districts? or any that you know of and have had a connection with in the past. So when we talk about these harmful things, we know that the harms for students of exclusionary discipline and punitive discipline, like out-of-school suspensions and alternative school placements. We know the harms of school policing and criminalizing youth in their schools. I think we're all familiar with the concept of the school to prison pipeline. So when we do these things that are harmful for kids, when we push them out of their classrooms, there's plenty of research at this point that shows that it is harmful for their connection to their peers, to their teachers, and to their schools. It's harmful for their school attendance. It affects their academic achievement and increases the likelihood of grade retention and decreases the likelihood that they'll graduate on time and go on to college. It affects their ability to find healthy ways to socialize with their peers and teachers. We know that it affects their emotional and behavioral health. And it also affects how teachers are able to teach, how they're able to focus on the strategies that enable them to efficiently and effectively manage their classrooms, to protect all students, and to encourage learning. And again, we know that these harmful strategies really destabilize the entire school climate. So not only harmful for the student that is experiencing them directly, but harmful for all of the other students who are in this environment where schools are relying on these harmful practices. And again, it means that we are not investing in these research-based, effective, proactive, fair strategies that allow us to address behaviors when they occur, whether they're from a student or from an adult in the school community, and actually have some meaningful restorative ways to deal with conflict when it happens, and to proactively build relationships and build those strong school climates that we want. What's interesting about these harmful practices is that we can kind of think about this sort of system as a bunch of different elements that are working together. So we can think about it as harmful discipline practices are perpetuated by policy. So we have policy at multiple levels that puts these harmful discipline practices in place. So for example, I'm here in Texas, we have state policy that allows school districts to create policies that say when students can be suspended and for what types of behaviors. Our state law says when students can be expelled or sent to disciplinary alternative education programs or schools. And so that's set in state and local policy. Those policies are then implemented by people. So you have the folks in schools, administrators and teachers and other staffs who are taking these policies and implementing them, mixing them with their own personal beliefs and biases. And then that leads to really creating this school culture where we are relying on these harmful discipline practices, not doing the things that we know work. And then that school culture, again, reinforces policy, leads us to create more harmful policy, entrenches harmful policy and keeps it in place because this is what we've been doing for years and years and years. And then we sort of have this vicious cycle of people and culture and policy that's leading to harmful discipline practices that negatively affect our students in schools. And of course, we know that there are certain students that are most likely to get caught up in this harmful discipline system because of their individual characteristics. So we know Black students are more likely to be punished through exclusionary and punitive discipline practices. We know kids who receive special education services, kids with disabilities are more likely to be punished instead of receiving the services that we want. So it's really critical that we figure out how to stop this really harmful cycle. As a bit of a case study, I have a bit of an obsession with corporal punishment. I hate it. I think it's terrible. I hope all of you do too. Since many of you are coming from schools and school districts and organizations in the US South, you likely live in a state that has a corporal punishment policy. There are still 19 of them, including most Southern states. So this is an example of policy really putting in place some harmful discipline strategies. We know corporal punishment is really harmful for students. It's harmful for them physically. They get hit, slapped, spanked, paddled in their schools. We know it is harmful for school climates. We know it is harmful in all of those elements that I mentioned before in terms of attendance and academic achievement and connections to school and socialization. But we have state policies and local policies in place. So here in Texas, this is the corporal punishment policy. It is handed down to school districts from the state, and those school districts that can then choose to implement it and create their own corporal punishment policies. It's then carried out by teachers and administrators, some who feel like they have very little control over how they're told to discipline students. And then it becomes ingrained in a school culture and a community culture. And when they hit students, they're not just doing, it's not that they're not doing the good things, but they're doing this thing that's affirmatively harmful. And that becomes a justification for other harmful policies, other things in schools, part of the school culture that are not healthy for students, and a justification to keep the one that we have in place. Well, we're using it in all these school districts. It's hard to get rid of it. People want it. People want to hold on to it. They don't know what else to do. And again, we have this really harmful cycle of individual biases and behaviors, school cultures, policies that all sort of feed each other and keep these things in place that we know are bad for students. The really interesting thing, and the thing that we'll discuss today about breaking that cycle, is that we can sort of use the same elements, but instead insert something that we know is good and helpful for students in school climate. So thoughtful policy, for example, how we implement, in this case, restorative practices into policy can change people's behaviors. We can help people to implement something that we know is good for students. We can give young people and adults in a school community the tools that we know actually work to support students and protect their rights and create these strong school climates. And then that becomes the school culture, and that starts to influence additional policy. And so this same cycle that sort of perpetuates the bad things that we see in schools can also be used to move forward really good, smart practices in our school communities, if we understand how to sort of integrate that into policy and practice in our schools and in our states. And I think the reasons for doing this the right way are really clear, but just to lay them out, we want individual student success. We want that for all of our students. This is why we all get into education in the various ways that we have gotten into it. We want students to succeed. We want to protect their rights. We want those safe and supportive school climates that serve all adults and support all students. We want everyone in a school community to feel like they belong and they're welcome and they have those strong relationships. And we want teachers, administrators, and other staff to feel like they have the tools to successfully achieve that vision that we have for schools. I'm going to check the chat and see if there were any questions about that, and happily turn it over to Terrence to talk about what that implementation actually looks like and what restorative practices are and look like and feel like in schools.
Absolutely. So thank you, Morgan, for kind of setting the stage for us about how these change policies can operate for us to remove some of the harmful disciplinary practices that we see. And so there are lots of different ways that school systems, individual schools, state agencies work to improve the school climate in the schools that we find. And so restorative practices is one way, but I wanted to say at the outset that it is not the only way that you can work on improving school climates in your schools. We think that restorative practices is a very effective way, and we're going to talk about why that is, but just wanted to say that it is not the only thing, and there are lots of opportunities for you all to see what other things you can do to move away from harmful disciplinary practices. But since we're here today and we're going to focus on restorative practice, we're going to do some discussion, have some discussion around why restorative practice is a useful tool versus other kinds of disciplinary actions that can be taken, and really going to talk about what it looks like both in the continuum of responses that you have to student behavior. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the impact of restorative practices on students and on schools. And so really, the first question, why restorative practice? These restorative practices, I should say at the outset, have been around for a long time. This is not something that we just created recently. Communities and indigenous folks and folks all over the world have been using restorative practices for hundreds of years, right? So this is, I want to say that at the beginning, that this is something that we've adapted, but we've also seen that there's research that underlies the reason why we use restorative practices as opposed to the way that we do things right now. And really the aim of restorative practices is to develop community and to manage conflict and tensions, right? So we think about our current responses to student behavior that is, developmentally appropriate is to punish that doesn't really, help the student, as we will see, and it doesn't help us create community. And so, the primary fundamental hypothesis for us to focus on in restorative practices is that human beings are happier, more cooperative, productive, and more likely to change when people in power and positions of power make decisions with them and do things with them rather than to them before them. And you all can think about this in your own individual, jobs or household, or the way you were raised, right? Think about the way that you felt when you had an incident or something happen, and you were able to come up with a strategy on how to respond with the people who may have been harmed, or with the person who was in an authority figure over you, right? Think about how bad it felt, or how disappointing it was when you had something done to you where you felt like you didn't have a right to participate in the process. You didn't know, how to be involved in making things better. And so I think with our young people, and really for all the folks in the school community, folks just feel better about moving forward after a disciplinary incident occurs when we're doing things together. And so restorative practices allows us a range of tools that we can use in order to do that and to move forward as a community. So, if you want to break it down as to, further as to what this does when you use restorative practices, you have an opportunity to build trust and cooperation. And there are really kind of three main, I add a fourth main characteristics of fair process, right? Which is basically the conception that we're doing things together and we're doing things with folks as opposed to folks. And so the first element of that is engagement, right? Where we are actually working with folks on the front end, where we're able to talk about the rules and what the rules are in consultation and in collaboration with the folks who are going to be subject to those rules, right? So we need to be working on disciplinary codes and expectations for behavior with students. The second piece of this is explanation, and so that things are clearly expressed to students, right, in terms of what the expectations are, what the code says around different kinds of behavior, right? These are the ways that we want to be working with folks. Folks feel more confident in the outcome if you're able to explain it to them at the outset. And then expectation clarity, right? I think one of the places where we get into a lot of trouble with our disciplinary practices, as Morgan mentioned, right, is that there's different expectations for different folks in different settings, right? So that's why I have that consistency as the fourth concept, right? That folks do not believe in a system if that system is applied unfairly. They may have been involved in the process, they may have been engaged, but when they see folks, their peers, right? When students see their peers who look different from them, who, are from a different background, have a different consequence, then it really breaks down the trust that we can have in the system. And so while you all are thinking about ways to move forward, even if it's not in restorative practices, these four elements are things that are really crucial in the way that you build your responses to student behavior, and thinking about ways to support them as well, not just to punish them. So, in terms of what restorative practices are, oftentimes when people hear restorative practice, they think about circles. Oftentimes people think about conferences, but restorative practice is really a toolbox. And so it's really a continuum. It's a range of tools that we have in order to deal with student behavior. But I also, think that it's primarily a way for us to build community. And so there are lots of different tools that we have that are under the umbrella of restorative practices. But the central thing, as you see in this graphic here, is that we're restoring our community. So if you our classroom communities, our school communities, if there's an incident, right, and we're building that community together. So I want you all to really think about, restorative practices not being a one size fits all. If there's an infraction, then we're going to use restorative practices. That's really a very limited view of what restorative practices are. And we're going to talk about a couple of examples of restorative practices, but a restorative practice can also be asking a student how they're doing and caring about that response. A restorative practice can be a conversation where you're valuing the family that student comes from, right? So we're going to talk about a few restorative practice examples, but I also want you all to get into the mindset that creating community, developing relationships, understanding the impact of harm is another way to have restorative practices. So we're going to give you a couple of examples, but these are not the only ways to practice, restorative approaches to dealing with students and to creating community. So, as I mentioned before, restorative practices is, again, a continuum. It allows us to really work from less formal interactions with students into more formal interactions with students. And I mean, in formality, I mean there are specific procedures and processes that we take when we're working with a conference, for example, which we'll talk about, versus, our everyday interactions with students that are informal. If they come up, we talk to them in the hallway, we see them, on the practice field, right? Like, these are all ways that are informal ways that we can build community that's lower on the formality continuum, but it's also a way of us expressing restorative approaches to working with students. And so I also want to highlight that, when we're thinking about the distribution of where we are spending the majority of our time, really 5% is really the area where we're going to be responding, or about 20, in a very formal way in terms of a conference, something like that. There's about 20% that's going to be responding with restorative practices to some infraction or something that happened. But we really, most of the 80% of restorative practice should be done before something has gone wrong or an incident occurs, right? We really should be building restorative practices with all of our students 100% of the time, but specifically working on proactive steps in 80% of the time versus 20% responding. So 80% proactive, 20% reactive. So the first kind of lowest level of informality for restorative practices is that we want students to learn and use affective statements and questions. And so these help students develop the ability to understand, one, their emotions, right? So if you see here, oftentimes, and folks that work with students recognize this, right? How are you feeling today? I'm good. How are you feeling today? I'm not so good, or I'm bad, right? Like, we want students to develop a robust vocabulary, and even us as adults, right? I won't put all this on students. A lot of us as adults, may not have been in practice of expressing our emotions in this way. So helping when we use affective statements and questions, it helps our students and the adults in the room understand their own emotions, and it helps preview for them how they can understand how what they do and how what we do in a classroom or in a school environment impacts other folks. So just to give you some examples, affective statements, these are usually question or statements that they're I statements, and they talk about how things make you feel. So, if someone, steals something from me, or if someone, punches me, right? Like, I'm going to have an emotion from that. And it's giving me the ability to express that emotion and let the person know who has done whatever to harm, me or the environment that we're in, that what they did has impacted me. And, it gives me that vocabulary. And so these are statements. We also use questions to evoke these, and we can talk more about them as we go forward as a response. But, they provide feedback. They are able to teach empathy for students. And a lot of this is being able to give them that vocabulary, as I mentioned. So if you see here, this is oftentimes when we do training with folks around restorative practices, we'll print out these as cards, and we'll give these to students and other folks implementing the practices, so that they can, when something happens, they can have the specific questions that they can ask that take them away from the punitive approach to dealing with whatever the situation is, right? Oftentimes, when something happens, like you ask what happened, but the idea is that you are looking to punish someone. So these additional questions that come from this, what were you thinking? Who was affected? You can see how we're starting to move away from the traditional, inquiry for how we are, looking at what happens in the restorative practice or when an incident happens. Circles is another very well-known restorative practice that folks use. There's lots of benefits to working in circles. You can do them as a response to something that happens. You can also use them in a way to build community, right? You can also use them as a way to deliver content. Circles are probably one of the most versatile restorative practice tools that we can use in our school environments. And there's lots of benefits to working in circles, right? There's no front, there's no back, it's a shared space. And so circles is a really useful tool for us to use when we're implementing restorative practices. And the most formal restorative practice that we often see is a restorative conference. So you'll often see these in the place of a disciplinary hearing. You'll often see these if there's something that's more serious that happens. And it's the most formal of our processes. So it involves having pre-interviews where you're understanding what happened beforehand and you're understanding if folks are willing to participate in the process and have a restorative outcome. You spend time in the restorative conference helping folks understand like what the rules are and interacting with one another. And again, at the end of this, you're going to produce an accountability agreement, which is basically a contract for how we're going to try to repair and restore what has happened in our community. And so I think it's often, these are interesting to think about because sometimes people push back on the use of restorative practices because they feel like, it's too squishy. There's not real accountability. This isn't a real response to something bad that happens. But I would say that often when you have accountability agreements that come out of this, they're often much more meaningful to the folks who have been impacted by something that happens. And it gives much more accountability to a student when you're comparing it to traditional disciplinary practices. If you're suspended from home, if you're suspended from school and you're at home, there's no real mechanisms to make sure that you're understanding what happened and the impact of your behavior. So we often use restorative conferences to push back on folks who say the restorative practices are not actually going to provide that accountability that folks are looking for. So there's a lot of different reasons that we use restorative practices. I think if you believe in the worth of, our students and our school spaces, and we have an interest in building positive school climates that are culturally sustaining, the restorative practices is a good place for us to start. But there's also been lots of studies that have been done around restorative practices, and it has a tangible impact that you can show. Things like reducing suspensions, reducing, behaviors that are not good for school environments, like bullying, things like that. It promotes positive relationships between peers and teachers and between peers and their other peers, right? So there's lots of examples. It creates declines in actual disciplinary rates in schools. So I think that, although there are academic reasons to engage in restorative practices, I also want you all to know and be confident that if you're in the process of implementing, or if you have a desire to implement restorative practice in your schools, there are also tangible, research-based academic studies that support the use of these tools versus other tools. So we'll get more into practicing kind of what this looks like in policy, but I wanted to give you a brief overview of what are some of the practices and what are some of the impacts. So with that, I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Terrence, and thanks, Morgan, for the overview. Before I launch into crafting restorative policies and a discussion around that, there were a couple of questions from, I think that you and Morgan might be well positioned to respond to, so I'll just read them out from the chat. The first one is, would love to know your thoughts on the implementation of the PBIS framework that allows schools to use data for decision-making, evidence-based practices for students, and effective systems for the adults. Either of you want to take a crack at responding to that?
Yeah, I think so. So we're talking about PBIS in terms of how it fits. I think so. Again, as I mentioned at the outset, that is a lot of these approaches to dealing with understandable student behavior build on one another and support one another. So PBIS is one that's a really great example because a lot of PBIS is about setting expectations for behavior and, rewarding students, right, when they're doing things in accordance with our expectations. Well, as I mentioned before, restorative practices, right, we remember that expectation clarity is a key part of the fair process that we use in restorative practices. And I think also that there's a focus on building community that can be partnered very well in places that are implementing PBIS. And because students are able to understand their emotions, right? You can reward students not just for the actual, putting the piece of paper in the wastebasket, right? You also can reward them for things that are going to be restorative in nature, right? So if they're doing things that are, bringing joy to their classmates, if they're doing things that are, making their other classmates happy, or however it might be, supporting them, right, in some way, these are also things that we can incentivize if you have a system of PBIS in place. So I think that they work really well together, and they shouldn't be seen as mutually exclusive. We often know when we've been working with schools, but I've worked with schools before, they say, well, we can't do restorative practice, we're already doing PBIS. Like these are frameworks that work together. And so we shouldn't think of them as mutually exclusive. So I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love how you framed it too, in terms of, when we're thinking about how do we create these shared values and this commitment so that the reward is not just extrinsic, right? It's not just coming from an immediate response, but it's also intrinsic, right? The gratification and the appreciation for our community. And so I do agree that they complement each other and work well together. So thank you for that, Terrence. There was one other question, and Morgan, maybe I'll go to you to start with this one. We have had a lot of problems on the playground and on the bus. Seems like we are increasing supervision and additional duty time for teachers. How do we change culture and community so that these spaces are peaceful from within rather than forced compliance? Oh, and Morgan, do we have you there?
Uh-oh.
Okay, it looks like Morgan might be having some connectivity issues. I'm happy to kick it off, and this actually dovetails really nicely with where we're headed in terms of how do we create the infrastructure to support restorative policies and practices. And it's really about how do we create a culture that's restorative, that values the inherent worth of every individual in the community, whether they're students, teachers, administrators, parents, and other community stakeholders. And how do we create a system where there's accountability and commitment to this restorative ethos that Terrence just laid out so critically. And so, Ashley, I do think that especially with returning to school, and there's a lot of tension, right? My mom is an educator, and she talks a lot about how do we re-socialize kids and how do we create shared agreements around how we're going to conduct ourselves in the classrooms and in the hallways. And so let's unpack that a little bit through the lens of how we can craft restorative policies. I think it was the foundation that Terrence laid out is so critical. And one of the things that I love about restorative justice and restorative practices is that it's really centered on storytelling. And so I'll begin with the story just to sort of set the stage for the why of putting restorative practices into policy. As an attorney, I spent a lot of time working with schools, doing traditional anti-discrimination policy work, and doing a lot of traditional investigations, right, and adjudication. So doing civil rights investigations, investigating complaints of racial harassment, sex-based harassment, gender harassment, and gender-based violence claims, in addition to run-of-the-mill claims like academic dishonesty and misbehaved, more general conduct issues. And what I found is it didn't matter how great of an investigator I was. It didn't matter how great my documentation was or how beautiful that policy that complied with state and federal laws with all the right citations looked like. It didn't matter how great that legal work product was because the output of that system was harmful. Right. Even when you can dot all the I's and cross all the T's, I kept finding over and over again that everybody, parents, students, teachers, we're just dissatisfied with outcomes. When they say when you're doing particularly civil rights investigations, 50% of the time, 100% of the time, 50% of the people are unhappy with the outcome. And so what I loved when I discovered and really invested in restorative practices was discovering this framework where, wow, maybe everybody, maybe we can create a space and an outcome and a system where our community can be restored and where our values can be reaffirmed, and we can build consensus as opposed to excluding, shaming, and basically discarding individuals who cause harm. And so that was my entry port to restorative justice and restorative practices, was looking for an alternative that validated the humanity of all the participants, that made educators not just disciplinarians, but people who care. And we know that is how the vast majority of educators approach the work, that view students as these beautiful rays of sunshine and hope and opportunity and potential, and not as troublemakers based on their identities. And so that is the why for me of why we really have to prioritize infusing restorative policies and practices into our policies, but also into just our broader value-based system. And with all of that wonderful framing, it's challenging. And I want to acknowledge that I've seen several comments in the chat already alluding to that effect. So here's how we'll unpack how to craft restorative policies on your campus. We'll talk first about how restorative practices differ from a traditional student conduct response. You've already gotten a preview of that from Terrence. We'll go a little bit deeper. We'll talk at a high level about how we define harm and what that looks like in the education space. And then because you have a panel of lawyers here, we wanted to make sure we talk about how can we attend to legal issues and implementation. There are some critical legal compliance concerns that you just want to be mindful of as you're building out these policies. And then we'll talk, I think it maybe was Ashley in the chat who talked about how do we implement this in a way where there's accountability and buy-in and consistency. So we'll talk about a whole campus approach for how to make that happen, in addition to an high-level overview of some state-level policy considerations. So I wanted to start with this awesome quote. There's a wonderful article. I've given you the citation here, and I'll just read it. The broad aim of restorative practices is for educational policy and practice to be more responsive and restorative to the needs and concerns of the school community. Thus, what has evolved in schools adopting an RJ framework is a clear awareness of the social and emotional foundation of the paradigm, specifically that human beings are relational, and justice is understood broadly as honoring the inherent worth of all and enacted through a relationship. And I just love this because it really gives the soundbite you've heard. It's picking up on all the principles that Terrence laid out and that were the main components of my story, right? And my entry point to restorative justice, that our policies should really be reflective of our values, including a social justice component, and this component that all individuals, all humans, and all children are inherently worthy of redemption and growth. So with that framing, how do restorative practices differ from our traditional conduct responses in our policies and in practice? Well, especially if you're engaging in misconduct responses, you're really laser focused on what rule was violated, right? When misbehavior occurs, we're looking immediately to our policies and we're having to justify, right? This was wrong because of this language in our policy. But depending on the nature of the misconduct, we're asking, how are we going to investigate it? How are we going to adjudicate it? If it's a civil rights concern, if it's harassment or a Title IX complaint, some kind of discrimination issue, there are specific rules around how we have to proceed to investigate that. And then we ask, how much evidence is there? We go and interview educators. We talk to the other students that are involved. We gather information. Depending on what your policy says and the nature of the complaint, maybe we're memorializing and documenting that information, spending a lot of time and energy putting those materials together. And then, of course, the critical question that we're really unpacking here is, how do we punish the person once we find that they have engaged in misconduct? And if they haven't, there's really often no infrastructure around, well, what do we do after we've gone through a process of investigating misconduct, and we don't find that something was wrong? We consistently find that there's not a lot of policy infrastructure to support how do we reintegrate those students after they've gone through that sort of disciplinary process. How does that differ from restorative practices? Well, instead of asking what rule was violated, we ask a much more basic question, which Terrence previewed for you earlier. What was the harm? And we'll unpack in just a minute what harm means in this context, but you can already begin to understand and imagine the transformative potential of that simple question. Instead of being focused and fixated on the particular policy language or sub-provision, and what the policy requires, we're really focused on what happened that that disrupted the community environment and that caused harm to the individual or the broader community that was impacted. And then we ask who's responsible. And the beauty of restorative practices is that there can be multiple folks that can be responsible, and there can be one person that's responsible. And so rather than engaging in this negotiation around who's at fault, there's room for everybody, including school administrators, the environment, the individual who caused harm, to be able to accept their role in contributing to the harm that was caused. And then how can we then, moving to that, how can we accept responsibility and how can we work together to solve the problem that the harm caused? And again, you can see this is just totally different than this traditional model of investigating and responding to a specific misconduct incident. And then I think getting at this question that a lot of the comments have been highlighting is, not only how do we repair harm, but how do we rebuild trust? And what's so unique about restorative practices in education is that we are a community and we see each other every day. Our lives and our experiences are so intertwined with one another. If your teacher's having a bad day, if a student's having a bad day, it really can impact the entire environment. And if somebody acts out, and sort of consistent with our goals of disrupting the harmful paradigms that create stereotypes and assumptions about individuals who engage in misconduct. Rather than allowing that to continue to unfold, restorative practices allows us to pause and say, what are the root causes? How can we work together to address them? And how can we rebuild trust in a person who causes harm, as opposed to how do we exclude and punish? And so this is, again, more of the why of why to incorporate restorative practices into our policies. Now, this is I always think it's interesting because, Terrence, you alluded to this, that people think restorative practices are mushy or hippie or what, pick your adjective there. But really, it's really a robust way of understanding misconduct and understanding, the word that I like to use is harm, and that it recognizes, as opposed to there just being a policy violation, that there's a whole range of ways that people are impacted by student behavior and misconduct. There are material impacts. So a student has broken something or caused some kinds of damage. The kids have gotten into a fight. So there's physical harm. You'll see that in our hypotheticals coming up, that a fight is involved. Somebody's stolen something, right? Those are all material, physical harms. And you can imagine how those harms show up in our policy, and you understand that, but totally blowing up that framework and thinking about it in these categories. There are emotional and spiritual harms. When somebody steals something, your sense of safety, of wholeness, of security, of trust, that's now been disrupted. If you've been, certainly certain types of civil rights violations, if you've been harassed or called a slur or some kind of impact in that way, that impacts you not only because the policy was violated, but that has a deep impact on your sense of self and your self-worth and your emotional standpoint. The communal and the relational harms. And that's, we've been talking a lot about how do we build community accountability and commitment to a restorative ethos. And so when harm is caused, it impacts not just the two or more individuals directly involved, but the ripple effects in the community. And how do we repair relationships fractured by some kind of student misconduct. And then obviously, and I think maybe this is one of the most important, one of the ways why I'm so passionate about restorative practices, is that it really makes room for addressing structural and historical harms in ways that Black letter law and policy do not. It allows us to acknowledge that when some kind of incident occurs, for example, if a racial or homophobic slur is used, it's really tapping into not only that it was a harmful incident between two people, but it's tapping into this broader paradigm of an historical harm that is compounding the impact of that incident. And restorative practices give us a way to acknowledge that, to name that, and that's a really important part of healing from an incident that has those implications.
And Paige, just so you know, we had a question in the chat around like not just harm, but trust in particular, and how that's going to be addressed. I know you'll get into some of this as well, but I just wanted to highlight that Ashley asked if she could know more about how you repair trust in particular as one of the specific harms.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would love to hear this get unpacked even more in our hypotheticals as well. I think we're well positioned to have that conversation with the scenarios that we've laid out, but I'm happy to preview it. One of the amazing things about restorative justice is that when you get people in a room together to talk about what happened, you ask that fundamental question, what happened? You begin to see each other, right, as humans, as opposed to being adversarial. You're fighting, it's one person's case against the other, who's telling the truth. The amazing thing about restorative justice is that there can be multiple truths, and that people can have their own experience, and that there's space for people to articulate and hold those experiences, and also to have their own experience and perspective changed by truly listening and hearing from another person about what happened, whether that's in a conference, which Terrence, you previewed, like that's a formal way of meeting that conversation, or whether it's in a circle where you learn and you begin to deepen your connections and understand each other better as part of a community. And so I think trust happens in both of those ways. So when you're facilitating your community circles, whether they're in the classroom or amongst educators, we see lots of really powerful educator groups getting together and having these community restorative circles. You begin to build trust in that way, because you are not positioned adversarially, and you're in sort of a safe space to have difficult dialogues. And so you can do it that way outside of the context of responding to specific misconduct. But when something bad happens and you're actually responding to some kind of misconduct, the way that trust can be restored is that, wow, you're seeing a person meaningfully engage in that dialogue. Like, that's the first step, right? So much of discipline is you interview one kid in one room, you interview the other kid in the other room, or somebody is yelled at in the classroom and they don't get a response to an opportunity to respond or tell their side of the story. So just by that simple act of creating space for shared dialogue and an opportunity to see, wow, this person, really is sorry for what happened, or now I can understand what might have caused them to act that way. Those are the little interpersonal ways that we can begin to rebuild trust, and we can unpack that more in our hypotheticals. Thanks for the question, and thanks for raising it, Terrence. So I previewed this. We do have some legal obligations, and our hypotheticals today will deal with questions related to civil rights, potentially civil rights concerns. We wanted to flag this. We know that there's a broad spectrum of harm that can occur in our schools, and it ranges from general misconduct, but it can include misconduct based on these protected categories of under state and federal anti-discrimination laws. And there are times where, when we're responding to these kinds of incidents, we do have to be mindful that there are, compliance concerns that we just have to, look out for, flag, and incorporate into our policies. The biggest one, and I say biggest because there's just so much regulation around how we handle it, is Title IX. And so if you're dealing with a response to sex-based misconduct, gender-based misconduct, or sexual violence, you really need to be checking in likely with your Title IX coordinator, your general counsel, because you do have to follow a very specific policy and process. And we'll talk about that in a minute. There's absolutely room and recognition that you can use restorative practice to respond to an incident of gender-based misconduct or violence. And so we'll talk about how to do that. The other places, and this, I love that Morgan flagged this right at the beginning, is we know that school discipline disproportionately impacts students on the basis of race, and specifically Black kids, Latinx kids, and on the basis of disability. And so we have to be mindful when we're designing our restorative practices and policies that we're ensuring that they're inclusive and accessible, and that we're making accommodations consistent with state and federal disability law, including Section 504 and IDEA. And then obviously Title VI requires us just to respond appropriately to incidents of race and national origin based discrimination. And so not as much of a robust regulation as Title IX, but just being mindful that when these sorts of incidents get reported, we really need to be sure that we're following whatever policy is in place under those specific anti-discrimination policies. The last thing I flagged here, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because we're not talking about legally, lawyerly things, but when things go, where we see implementation of restorative practices go wrong is in this issue of due process and what I've called here contractual considerations. And so the long story short, if you put something in your policy, you have to follow it. And so to the extent that you're putting, in your policy, as you should be, right, provisions around notice and transparency and the process for how things are going to move, it's really important that you're following that policy, because where things go wrong is where students or parents are able to point to, wow, we didn't have an opportunity to be fully apprised of the nature of the misconduct. And this is particularly true for civil rights claims. So you want to make sure that where you have a written policy, that you're following it, and if you want to deviate from that policy, that you work with your teams to update it so that and make it sufficiently flexible so that you don't get into any trouble there. I mentioned that we'll just talk briefly about Title IX. I just think it's important because the 50th anniversary of Title IX is actually this year and coming up. There's a lot of conversation about that. And the U.S. Department of Education is actually engaging in rulemaking that's going to be addressing how schools respond, including K-12 schools, respond to sex-based misconduct. And so I just wanted to flag that if you want to use a restorative justice conference or mediation or other restorative practice to respond to a complaint of gender-based misconduct, you really have to absolutely check in with your policy and likely with your Title IX coordinator on this. Some of the three big things that I just want you to take away from this is, if you are a professional and the nature of the misconduct that you're referring to or responding to has a sexual or gender-based component, you have to be trained and you have to be able to show that you've been trained in informal resolution under your policy. The second is that there are really specific notice requirements for a complaint that falls under Title IX. And so again, you're just checking in and you're making sure that you're providing them. And that there's the overarching concern is voluntary participation. And so really making sure that that you're not pressuring any survivor in particular of gender-based or sex-based violence or other gender-based misconduct. There's no pressure for them if they want to pursue a more formal, traditional response to the harm that was caused to them, that we're making sure that they have space to do that. And I just put this comment here. I think it's really amazing and an amazing victory for advocates. This is guidance from the Department of Education from last August, I believe. And this is the first time that I've seen in Department of Education policy where they actually expressly recognize the right of schools to use restorative justice to respond to complaints of sexual misconduct. And so I just think that's amazing. It's a testament to the research-based effectiveness and the power of the amazing advocates who got that. And I wanted to just flag that quickly. Finally, there were lots of questions about how do we implement restorative practices. I won't go too deep in the weeds. We'll leave time for to go in deeper in the breakouts. But we really advocate for a whole campus approach, right? And really, we want to encourage everybody to engage in their classrooms and in their workplaces restoratively, regardless of what's in your policy, using the values that Terrence and I have talked about. But if you're looking to implement into your policy, it's so critical that you get whole campus buy-in. So that's not just teachers and students, but it's administrators, it's parents, it's the broader community-based organizations that can support your work. And there's amazing organizations that can do that, including IDRA. You want to make sure that you're talking to students about what does restorative justice look like? What does it feel like? Facilitating some of those community circles that Terrence talked about to help people get introduced to and used to the idea of engaging restoratively with one another. You want to review your current policies and think about how can we begin to build them in. And I think a big consideration here is how can we build policies that are leave room and acknowledge the opportunity to engage restoratively, but aren't too prescriptive, right? We don't want to draw up a policy that limits our ability to respond restoratively, consistent with the needs with the individuals in front of you. You want to be able to have some flexibility to design a process that meets the needs of the harm party primarily, but of the broader community. Now, lots of schools are like, okay, we're all in on restorative justice. We've read that research that Terrence flagged. We know that it's great. We've experienced a circle and we want to do it more. And you want to go all in. And my recommendation to you would be, that's great. And let's pick a way to focus our response. A really great way that I've seen a lot of schools do this successfully is picking a category of misconduct and really committing to, okay, when this happens, we are going to convene a circle or restorative conference. And that way people can build that consistency that we talked about, and it doesn't feel so unwieldy. You know, we want to infuse restorative practices in every aspect of our relationships, but if you're really looking to formalize a response, picking a category, whether, you know, it's a general conduct violation or dress code violation, or pick your a playground misconduct incident. You really want to think, okay, when this happens, this is what we're going to do, and begin getting your educators and your administrators on board and building a record of success. And pick things that are easier to deploy. Don't pick the most difficult, violent incident right up front. You know, you want to have skilled professionals supporting your work if you're just getting started and doing restorative justice work. Yeah, and thanks, Terrence, for reminding us and making sure we're doing the proactive along with the reactive. I think that's really great. And then as we're growing our skills of doing restorative practices, really constantly assessing, okay, how can we continue to expand using restorative practices to respond in other conduct incidents? How can we have even broader and deeper community building circles? And how can we begin to assess and document our success so that we can tell our story and tell the amazing impact of using restorative practices in our community to others and replicate it throughout our districts, throughout our communities. And so really bringing it in that tiered approach to really maximize the potential for success. Now, just as a big picture, you know, this is a 2009 article by Thalia Gonzalez, who's another attorney who really studies restorative practices and policies across the country. And I just think it's helpful. Sometimes you feel that when you're advocating for restorative justice that, you know, maybe you're getting pushback, that it is not rigorous enough or that it's not tangible enough. And how do we do it? But the big picture is restorative practices are really being codified at every level, whether it's, you know, I gave you that federal guidance all the way down to the school board level. And there's a lot of value to that, right? We're really normalizing the use of engaging with each other restoratively. And again, we just want to be careful. A concern is that we want to make sure that we are stating our values in policies and creating space to engage restoratively, but we don't want to limit or overly prescribe our policies and practices so that we can still have flexibility as we continue to learn how these policies work for our community. And with that, Terrence, I saw there's a question from Ashley. Can you give an example of a proactive response versus a reactive response?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. You know, the proactive responses are the things that we mentioned before on the low end of the informality spectrum, thinking about affective statements, affective questions, and circles. And they can be used for things that aren't related to discipline, right? So if you've got an assignment, right, where you want students to talk about, you know, how an assignment impacted them, right? You can have them do that in a circle. You can ask those same kinds of affective statements, right? So that they're getting in the process of thinking about their emotions, right? And those community building circles are are one of the really good proactive tool, because they can be done every morning, right? If you come into your classroom, right, you can check in with folks. And it's really one of the areas where you see a lot of time spent, right? Because you're using it not only for content for your courses, but you're also using it to check in with students and to build relationships. And I think those reactive, things you're going to see be a smaller portion when something happens, when there's a conflict. But you can also handle those with a less informal, with a less formal response, right? Not every thing that happens, although it may cause conflict, may not need to be a conference, right? Everything doesn't need to be a formal response. So those are some examples that come to mind for me. But, I want you to think about it in terms of when we're building community, when we're building capacity for students to understand those emotions, when we're building an understanding for them to understand harm, then we're doing things proactively versus when we're responding to an incident that's reactive. So I see the question from Lowell around restorative practice in higher ed, instances of academic dishonesty or other infractions. We typically, I won't say, I'll speak for me and then I'll let other folks, Morgan and Paige speak to the higher education thing. Although we we work primarily in a K-12 kind of space at IDRA, a lot of our work is focused there in preparing students for college. We're working in the K-12 environment. I think that, one of the things that we can see benefit folks in every instance, right? Whether it be higher education or whether it be in your workplace, right? We see that these responses, people actually perform better. And a lot of the background research around, performance shows that, when folks are in these different settings, adults, right? Not young people, but adults, they actually do better when they feel like fair process is observed. And so I think that, to the extent where we're working with, in college, you're young adults, but you're still adults. I think the same principles apply in terms of how that will make students in higher education spaces more likely to be involved and feel better about the processes. And you're going to have better outcomes when you're doing things with students, developing those policies with students. And so I'll see Paige and Morgan if you all have a thought on that. But I think that the concepts are transferable to adult settings in all different kinds of ways, and higher education should be no different.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the answer to the question is yes, there's absolutely a lot of work being done in higher ed and incorporating restorative practices, and many of the same ways and as in K through 12, with the exception that, you're dealing with adults primarily in those spaces, and you're dealing in communities that are residential. And so you're seeing restorative practices certainly being used to deploy in response to, misconduct that's engaged in on college campuses. And so you're seeing that a lot in offices of student conduct, including Title IX. We're seeing a lot of focus and work around that in that space. And to build community, right? We're seeing circles and residence halls and student organizations amongst administrators and professionals and departments to facilitate, deeper relationships and establishment of values amongst the community. So I think Terrence is exactly right. It's across the board. It just is adapted for the particularities of the populations of higher education.
Excellent.
I see a question from Katie, which I'm going to ask you, Terrence, if it's okay if you answer that one, because Katie is asking for or Paige, week 1 activities, and you were giving a few examples before. I'll just say to also, support what Terrence said. I feel like it's really a lifelong style of community building in no matter the community that you're in. Like I have a 6 and an 8-year-old, and I do not punish them in certain ways or believe in punishing them in certain ways, but instead think about like how to incorporate these ideas of like how we build family community even within our own household. And so when we were talking earlier about making sure, Paige mentioned this, everyone in a school community is involved in restorative practices, including parents and families and other folks that are not maybe in the classroom every single day. That's part of both sort of, complementing the work that is going on within the school each and every day if you are invested in restorative practices, but also making sure that those same strategies that allow you to build community and resolve conflict in a really healthy way and build up those skills in young people, they're getting it in every single setting, whether it's at home. And then when they go to other places in the world, they will be prepared to implement these strategies as well. Terrence, did you want to take Katie's question or Paige?
Sure. So
hello, Well, thank you for that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of things you can do. I mean, the first thing I would say is to be explicit about it, right? When you got folks coming into the classroom, there are different ways that you can approach that space, right? You can approach it as a space where we're only focused on the academics that are going on in the classroom, right? But I think that if you are explicit about the purpose of this space, even though it's a classroom, we're going to learn together, but we're also going to build community. I think that's vital. And I think that setting expectations for how you're going to work together, we talked about group norms and things like that for how your mini community, which is your classroom, is going to work. I think that's a really key thing to do, is setting in consultation, right? As I mentioned, fair process, engagement, like setting expectations for how your community is going to work. And that could be things around, turn it, the way you talk about your syllabus, right? That could be a way of talking about building community. Like, these are our expectations, and here's what happens. Here's how we're going to support one another to build a community. I think another thing that we often do when we do circles in particular is that we have folks bring something into the space that has meaning for them. And we use that, when you have a circle in particular, when folks bring something in, it could be something from home, or it could just be, a memory that they share, something that's meaningful to them. And you have that shared relationship of having something that's important that folks can talk about. I think that's really important to start building community, because folks can see their peers as not just someone next to them in class, but as a person who has things that are important to them that they can talk about, right? And there's some build connection in the space. And I think, the other thing is also helping folks understand that emotional piece, right? The affective piece of what you expect folks to be able to talk about, right? And practicing, on a daily basis, and having them practice with each other, right? So there's lots of different ways for you to do it, but I think being explicit about it and talking about it is the best way to highlight for the students that this is the kind of space. And I will say, like, students are intuitive, right? When they're in a classroom and they know the teacher is only going to, lecture, then that's what they adjust to. But if in their classroom and the teacher makes it explicit from the very beginning that we're building community, we're going to support each other, like, that's the way that they interact. And they're not going to do it perfectly every time, because no person is perfect. But I think, if you set that expectation in the beginning, it gives you an opportunity to come back to that, right? If something happens that's not in alignment with that expectation, you have the language and the framework to help bring them back to that core community space. So those would be some of the activities, but there are lots of others that you can think about. And let me see, I'm trying to think of what books I would recommend. I'm gonna think about that. Let me think about that, Katie. Which book I think would be best? Paige.
And if any of you listening have recommendations, we would love to curate a little book list. If you all have things that you use, that would be helpful. Please pop them in the chat. Paige, did you want to say something? Okay. I just will quickly say, before we're going to go into a short break, we have mentioned this throughout, but because it is very timely right now, these strategies are good for building community in schools all the time. And that's what we need to be doing in every school all the time, especially when we're doing that instead of relying on, harmful discipline techniques, for example, that we talked about at first. This is also a school safety issue, which I know is something that we're all thinking about right now. And really pondering in terms of policy, how do we support really safe schools? And lots of research shows that school safety, in every sense of the word, it's the daily safety that kids feel, that every single child feels, the emotional safety, the safety in relationships, even the safety from some forms of physical harm comes from relationship building. Folks who just focus on targeted school violence, for example, will name building relationships as the key to identifying what it is that students and adults need, addressing problems early, making sure students know that they are supported, that if they come with a concern or complaint, either for themselves or for their peers, they will be met with support and resources rather than suspicion or fear or suspension. And so when we think about school safety in every aspect of the word, for every single student and every adult in the building, relationship building through these practices is really key to making sure that we have those safe school climates that we want for everyone. I see Haley has a question. I know ideally restorative practices involve the entire community, but are they something that should be scaled up from classroom to district or scaled down from district policy to the classroom? Fantastic question. Terrence, do you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that we've seen, we can talk about it in terms of where these things can go wrong, right? So we definitely have seen when the district says we're doing restorative practices and they tell all of the classroom teachers to start doing circles and they do a 1 day, or 2 day professional development, that those things, there's not a lot of buy-in because again, it's that same concept of fair process, right? When people feel like things are being done to them, then it's something that is more difficult to do. Now, that doesn't say that it can't work, right? If there's lots of support and there's lots of training that folks feel supported when they're doing it. But I think it's important to have leadership on board, but it's also important that these decisions and these approaches are things that folks are willing to do and excited to do in their own classrooms, and that you don't want it to feel like another requirement that folks are going to resent. And I think that is a concern if you have a top down, district down to the school, classroom level. But there's also ways if you go the other direction, right? So if you've got a great classroom teacher who's doing restorative circles and the students step outside the classroom and they've got, other teachers or other resource officers or folks who are not operating in that school environment in a restorative way, then there's only so much that one classroom can do to be impactful. So, I think that the best way for this to work is for there to be a partnership and shared collaborative decision-making between folks who are going to be implementing at the classroom level and folks who are at the district level in implementation. And it's really got to be, again, the same way of working together that we're modeling with our young people, right? Like whenever you're doing any change process, and you all can think about this in your own jobs, right? Having an opportunity to have a say in what happens is really, really important. But it also makes a whole lot of difference if the folks in leadership positions value your opinion and value the direction that you're trying to move. So I think it's a both and there are different ways for it to break down if you don't have buy-in from both the leadership at the district level and folks in the classroom level. So I don't know if there's one better way to do it, one direction, but I think that, doing it together is the best way that it works for all the parties involved.
I would agree with that. And if I were going to add just another layer of policy that can influence this, it's thinking, sometimes we hear about people that want to implement ways to do restorative practices through state level policy. And the same concern sort of exists there. And I see you, Katie, mentioning them in the chat. Like if you do something that is too top down, do you have the buy-in that really makes it work? And then if you are having something that is, on the surface called restorative practices, but it's not being implemented with fidelity, do you then produce like bad data suggesting that restorative practices actually aren't working in the school? And then you have even more problems with buy-in in the future. So there are all sorts of concerns policy-wise. I do think, though, that there is a place, in addition to what Terrence said about schools and districts, states can certainly do things to change the language in state policy, encourage districts to adopt certain policies that at the very least, put the structure and framework and resources in place to support schools that are ready to transition and begin to use restorative practices. So if it is funding for restorative practices coordinators in districts and schools, at the very least, changing how we think about policy. So for example, here in Texas, our discipline chapter in our education code is called Discipline, Law, and Order. It is almost exclusively focused on the punitive, how we punish students, how we criminalize students. If instead we start to incorporate this language into policy and do what Terrence just described and create this culture of turning toward things that we know are research-based and work, rather than focusing on the punitive and the exclusionary as the only response that we have to certain behaviors or perceived behaviors, then we can sort of change how districts are thinking about what they can do and what the options are. And they know that they have the support of the state or other folks to do that. And it's not saying implement this right now. It is saying, here's where we need to move culturally in our schools. Here are the resources to do that. Here's the support to do that.
Absolutely.
Hello, Paige.
And I think that you know, that providing examples, I see what Tiffany put in the chat around providing examples. Absolutely. I think that we have to change, use the research and use the data that we have in order to make an impact that way. We definitely have to have like good examples, right? Good, you know, I will say that in a lot of work that we've done, we can talk until we're blue in the face and we can have the best research and the best data, but having students who have been through this process and talked about how impactful it was to have a restorative, you know, response to something that happened to them versus a punitive response, I think that that's really powerful, right? So it's not only like demonstrating through research and through data and all those things, but it's also like in like letting folks tell their own stories about how these things impact them. And it really does there's a real human impact to being supported versus to being excluded, right? If you think about in your own life, a time where you've been excluded and how that made you feel versus a time where you felt included and supported, I think that's something that our legislators and our lawmakers, if we can find a way, like that's something that we all understand instinctively. Like, so I think that it's important for us to be able to make that connection for them as to how these policies and practices relate to that feeling. And so, you know, we can do that with data to the extent that they listen to it, research all those things, but I think also supporting our families, our students to be able to speak, you know, to their own principal, speak to their own superintendent, to their own school board about how these things impact them is really, really important. So I just wanted to highlight that too.
Thank you. Paige, we're talking policy and implementation. If you want to add anything on that front, I know that you didn't hear the last few minutes of what we said before we go to a break. Just wanted to see if you had any last thoughts.
No, I think good.
Okay, cool. So we're gonna take a very short break before we go into breakout rooms. The breakout rooms are gonna be so exciting. So please, we'll be back. Let's do 5 minutes. So we'll be back at 10:55. Then we're going to divide you into breakout rooms, possibly 11:55, depending on where you're coming from. We're going to divide you into breakout rooms and work through some hypotheticals together.
All right, welcome back. Welcome back, everyone. Thank you all for participating in that activity. We're going to be doing share outs here in just a moment. But while we're doing that, we're going to see if we can get everyone to be able to come on camera and on microphone. But in the meantime, we're going to do a little bit of modeling of some of our restorative practices. And if you all would use the chat so we've got pictured here, the emotion wheel. And and try to tell us like what that activity, how that, like what emotions came up for you as you were in the course of doing that activity. So you've got lots of different emotion words here. So in the chat, if you wouldn't just let us know like how that activity made you feel and what emotions came up for you. Thoughtful. Thank you, Cheryl. What other emotions come up for folks that they can see? Aware. Okay. Hopeful. Aware. Okay. We'll give it another minute. Okay. Thoughtful, worthwhile, aware. A lot of awareness. A lot of folks feeling more aware after that conversation, which is a good thing. Wonderful. So we said it in the thing a few times that we wanted a spokesperson. So whoever that identified spokesperson is, if you would let us know how the conversation went in your breakout groups. And we've got a couple of questions, but let us know which hypo you worked on first, and we can go from there. And you should be able to use your camera and microphone at this point if you are the spokesperson. Either one.
I can go for my group. I was with Lowell, Dr. Noka, and Tiffany, if that's cool. But we talked about both scenarios, actually. The first one, honestly, I think was a little bit more cut and dry. First, we talked about what would happen in our respective spaces, whether our experiences when we were students or in after-school programs that were run, and experiences, principals, teachers, all of that. But the understanding was mostly that what would happen right now with policy is that the students would be written up, and they would have to talk about what they did with their parents, and if they committed the acts multiple times, then suspension would be on the table. But something we talked about just with this scenario was that the intent really mattered. So the students weren't mad at each other. They weren't trying to hurt one another's feelings. We talked a lot about cultural relevance, and that they really may have just been playing and not knowing that they were committing harm. So suspending them actually may do more harm to those students than what was initially what they were trying to do in the first place. And so we talked about how a lot of harm was potentially done by the word that was used. So because of the teacher and how he identified, unknowing how other students in the classroom also identified if they heard this word talked. And we talked about how this would be more conducive to be a teachable moment with those boys, especially because they're Black boys. So really connecting it to understanding how harmful words within their own community relates to harmful words that are used within other marginalized groups as well. And like the importance of not using that word, even if they aren't trying to hurt anyone's feelings. But yeah, that was our discussion on the first scenario. Should I do the second or pause? And
No. I want from your group. I have a couple of additional thoughts and curiosity about how you all approach. So we talked about the harm for the two boys and for the teacher. Did you all discuss at all the harm on the classroom community? Was that part of the conversation that you all had?
Yeah, we talked about how harm was caused to them. One, because unknowing how the other students in the classroom identified. So harm could have been caused to a student that may identify as gay or part of the LGBT community. But then also Lau actually brought up the fact that once students needing to actually get their work done, and one student may have needed more like focus or attention and concentration in the classroom, but the ruckus that was being caused was inhibiting that student from learning as well. So multiple levels of harm.
Multiple levels. Okay. And then tell us a little bit about the restorative outcomes that you all imagined.
That, I guess, going back to using it as a teachable moment and making it an entire classroom conversation, like obviously speaking to the two boys specifically about what was done, but that it was probably unnecessary to write them up because they weren't meaning to cause harm. So having a conversation with them about the history of that word, why it shouldn't be used, connecting it to like their experiences when words have been used against them, shouldn't be used, but then also making it a teachable moment like for the class as well, just about like that word, not using it, and just like how harm is caused even when unintentionally.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, can we hear from the other group spokesperson before we around Hypo 1? Or Morgan, do you have additional questions for this group around Hypo 1?
I do not. I thought that was a wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. So can we hear from the other group about this first hypo? Uh-oh. Did the other group not elect a spokesperson? Other group in the chat. I can't remember who was in that group now. Okay. Let's if Haley wasn't in your group, and we are talking to you, other group.
Yeah, maybe that was the confusion. There were two groups. So if you were not in Haley's group, we are waiting to hear from you.
That's right.
We did not select a spokesperson. You are correct.
That
Whose
is okay.
voice are we hearing?
This is Ashley.
Ashley, do you want to talk about it? Hi.
I just didn't want to talk too much. I was like waiting for. Does anybody else from group want to share?
I think you're the one, Ashley. I think you're the one.
Okay. So we discussed in scenario 1 how we might see it roll out in our teaching environments, and it would have gone to straight to administrative referral, and like there would have been an ISS, and how it's a big missed opportunity to kind of having a teachable moment and build community and educate, like all of the things that were highlighted from our first group. Did you say it was Haley that just spoke? Yeah, that most likely in our current environments that may have been missed completely, and that it just would have gone to like a discipline referral process rather than a teachable moment and kind of restorative practice.
Excellent. I think one other thing that is interesting that I just wanted to highlight for folks is, we mentioned earlier, and this scenario may not directly tie into it, but it's something for us to also be thinking about in terms of Title IX. So, there's been guidance around Title IX that's focused on gender, but it's also inclusive of sexual orientation. And so, there's protections for students against discrimination based on those factors, and for educators as well. So even if this scenario, right, because of the word that was used as a derogatory term for that community, I think that it's something for us to think about. Although, whether or not this would be something that would be included would be something we would have to consider, but also realizing that, our LGBT students, and this was mentioned by both groups, they also have particular protections, legal protections for them based on that identity. So just wanted to highlight that as well. But you all, 100% identified a lot of the areas of harm that are there to the different groups. And in a restorative conference, it would be really important for the facilitators to make sure they talk to the students who had created the harm, to the other students in the class, to the teacher, and understanding how these things impacted them before they came into that conference. And I 100% agree that a lot of the things you all mentioned, teachable moments, accountability within the rest of the classroom, using it as a learning opportunity, are all different ways that are restorative ways that we could approach what happened in the classroom. So, Morgan, anything else on Hypo 1 before we move on to Hypo 2?
Just curious if Ashley or anyone else from the group had anything to add about like the other questions that were posed. And if you said it and it cut off for me, apologies. But potential restorative outcomes or anything else that you thought of that is different than how you acknowledged it might have been handled currently in your school.
Now would be the repairing the relationship, restoring that trust, discussing between everyone, not only just the two boys, but also in the classroom. How can we restore the trust in our community and the trust in our friends that may or may not know that the word they were saying was derogatory. So definitely that repairing the trust, restoring that in the classroom and between each other and with the teachers as well.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Should we move to Hypo 2? So Ashley, do you want to start us off here? Give us y'all's initial impression from your group, potential responses, harms that were implicated, et cetera, et cetera.
I have to look at the scenario again.
I think I can.
Maybe we can just read it so that we're all. So it is the one where at a high school in San Diego, two students were involved in a fight based on their racial backgrounds. Alex, the Latino student, called Josh the N-word. Josh confronted him and began a fight. Alex threw the first punch. Josh punched him back. Alex gets a concussion. Josh leaves the scene. Though Alex initiated the fight, Josh caused the most physical harm.
We noticed that there's a sense, again, like we talked about how it probably would be handled, like a discipline referral, but that involving parents, there's a current, it makes, we know that ideally involving parents and having people to facilitate the conversation about the harm that was done and understanding the impact of the harm on the community and between the students would be important, but that we were fearful of just the explosive nature and reactivity of like how parents would react to defend their children, and how we've seen that play out where there's a lack of understanding. It's almost like everybody needs to practice how to communicate and listen, and that there would be like a fear to even involve the parents to try to have them talking to each other. That was mentioned in our group because of like that it might make it worse rather than repair. And I think that we are hopeful that by bringing restorative practice, like it could get better, but that the whole community needs to be, the whole school community and the parents need to be on board with it.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, involving the whole community and setting expectations early that this is the way that we respond to all types of conflict that we experience, including conflicts like the ones that are posed in the hypothetical, right? When folks come into a school, often they are given a student code of conduct, which lays out expectations usually for when a kid will, for example, be suspended. We should be able to set the same expectations, but in a more robust way based on authentic engagement with families about the way that that particular campus, that particular school district plans to proactively, and when there's a problem, be responsive to conflict and harm when it occurs. And that won't solve the problem of some parents still being upset, but at least we have laid out from the beginning, this is how our school community approaches relationship building and harm. When these types of incidents occur, this is how we plan to respond. And so people are prepared that this is the way that the school has chosen to operate. Just as we prepare people for all types of punishments and discipline and all the things that we don't want in a school.
And again, it's that fair process that we've been talking about, right? Like making sure that we're engaging folks in creating what the disciplinary responses are going to be. And also, I think, as administrators and leaders, we may be worried about how parents are going to respond. But if you consider the alternative where you just suspend the students, those feelings that they're going to have are going to be there anyway, and they're going to come up again, and the feelings that the students have are going to be there anyway. And let's be honest, those students, if they're suspended is for a specific period of time, they're coming right back into that school environment, right? Those parents are going to be right there at the meetings. And so it really, avoiding it via a suspension or exclusionary discipline would not help calm the fears of those parents that are going to be there, right? So we think it's kind of restorative practices gives us a mechanism to address those concerns that parents have dead on. So we definitely hear you on that. Okay. Anything else from that
Yeah,
group?
I'm wondering if that group, anybody have anything else?
Right. Can I note something that obviously these hypotheticals are designed to sort of trigger and issues that are sort of occurring in a larger social and historical context, which Paige brought up earlier in her presentation, that restorative practices are a really interesting way to be able to get at like sort of the deeper issue that might be triggering some of the behaviors that are posed in the hypotheticals. And so the other good thing, in addition to sort of saying to families and students, here's how we handle it, is that, the restorative practices and addressing particular issues with restorative practices are designed to really support teachers who might be struggling in a really difficult situation to know exactly what to do. And I'll give an example. I worked with a group of teachers over the past few months, and many of them mentioned that students in their schools say the N-word just sort of left and right with impunity, and nothing sort of happens. And every time it happens, even though it has happened a number of times, they are like paralyzed because they don't know what to do. And so their response was, well, I'm not going to do anything because it's not my place. I'm not Black, so I'm not going to jump into that. Or I'm going to report it to one of the few Black teachers at the school so they can handle it because that's more in their lane. But everybody needs to understand how to handle an issue that compromises the strength of the community, that compromises the safety of students when it happens. And having that sort of laid out from the beginning is not only helpful to respond to the issue when it occurs and protect students, but it's also really good for educators and other staff to be equipped with these tools so that in difficult situations, they know exactly what the protocol is and how we implement a process that is restorative to address what has happened.
Absolutely. Other group, Haley's group, anything additional in our last few minutes together?
I think just in addition, I guess we talked about just how words and emotional harm can cause just as much damage as physical harm, especially in the sense when you're talking about these things that are so based in historical and social constructs that are still currently relevant. But Morgan just talked about this point, but Tiffany brought it up in our group as well, that just the proactive way of handling this, it could have been resolved or not have become an issue at all if the teachers and the adults and leadership in the school had cultural diversity training and weren't afraid to have those conversations with students, because something Tiffany brought up, and feel free, Tiffany, to jump in because I'm just saying what you said, but something he brought up was just the fact that the student, Josh, that ended up causing the most physical harm, but he was harmed first emotionally. He obviously didn't feel like he could go to a teacher to handle the issue. Like, he felt like he needed to handle it himself. So the lack of support that he had, or that was apparent just in the scenario, for feeling like he needed to confront Alex on his own and not be able to go to an adult and say, like, this is something that happened, and trust that, like, correct responses would have been taken. It speaks to how there was a lack of understanding and cultural diversity responsiveness just within that school in general. But yeah.
No, I mean, it's a really good point. And I think being proactive and having folks with an awareness of what to do is important there. And I also think the point around, you know, as I mentioned in terms of Title IX stuff, right, there's also protections against racial discrimination. There are laws around systemic discrimination against students, right? So I think if this is an issue that is, you know, happening often and is not getting addressed, right, like that is a systemic issue that goes beyond just what these two students are experiencing in this moment. So I think it's a really good point for us to think, like, not just about what happened between these two students, but some of the institutional kind of decisions and supports that are available for young people. You know, like, do you have a way to address, you know, anger management? Do you have other kinds of supports for young people who are dealing with other kinds of trauma, right? Like, these are all things that, you know, we see the fight is really a symptom of some other things that may be going on, either between those two students or just in that environment, in that context. So I think it's a really good point, and I'm glad you brought it up, because oftentimes we think about, you know, what happens between students as something that's just about the students, but, you know, we're encouraging folks to think broader about what's happening with the adults, what's happening in the school, what's happening in the policies of that district. So I'm glad you brought that up. And then I was just curious about the restorative. So what was y'all's, you know, other than having additional training and things like that, what was the restorative approach that you all thought would be a good outcome we could get here?
That one, we didn't really get to it that much because it's just a little less cut and dry. I guess just because Alex, the student that initially caused the harm, he did get hurt. We talked about how, like, normally what would happen is both students would be suspended and Josh would have been punished more than Alex. Dr. Nilka brought up how police probably would have been involved and it would have been this whole thing. But I guess as far as we got is that it should be, like, yes, address the fact that Alex got hurt, but also address the fact that the only reason Alex got hurt is because Josh felt like harm was done to him. But per a solution to how that would be resolved, we didn't think of one.
Yeah, we kind of got stuck on talking about just the fight in itself and how it even got started. But I think a restorative practice for it is really stepping into that space of this was physical and emotional harm, and sitting there and discussing it as they're getting their medical aspects taken care of, a facilitator being with them as they're holding their head and as he's looking dizzy. Did you like that? You know, I teach smaller kids, but even in high school, did you like what happened? Let's reevaluate. Oh man, you said this word and it caused an emotional reaction. What is something different we can do as we're medicating our heads? And then of course, going in with following up with parents and just really trying to set those agreements into the classroom. We don't want this to happen. So how can we prevent it from happening again? Because anybody that saw that fight, anybody that heard it was also affected as well.
Very, very good point. Excellent. Well, thank you all for your examination of these topics. You know, there are 100 different hypos that we, you know, thought about giving you, and these are just a few that touched on some of the areas definitely related to discrimination, whether it be gender or race, that add an additional layer to conflicts within schools. And so I think, it's important for us as we do restorative practices that we also realize the cultural context that our students have and that our communities have, and that identity is an area that can, that can be harmed, right? You can, based on your identity, you can feel singled out, you can feel discriminated against. I think it's always important for us as, folks interested in equity and social justice, and we're also thinking about ways that folks are marginalized, right? We could have one based on religion, we could have one based on lots of different other intersecting identities. And so it's important for us to have a good capacity to understand how those, impact what's happening in the interactions between our students. So thank you for such a careful consideration of those. Before we ended, we're getting close to time here. I wanted to someone had asked for a link about different books that they might be able to access. I just put a link in the public chat around that. Also want to encourage folks to make sure you fill out your evaluation after you end this webinar. That's really important for us to make sure that you all are getting the things that you need. And I will pass it over to Morgan and see if she has any last words and words of wisdom for us as we move forward out into the world.
Oh, I don't have words of wisdom, but I do have words of gratitude and thanks for all of you coming to this session, participating so thoughtfully, sharing your own experiences, and being so open to engaging with what we're presenting. So thank you all so much for your time and energy today. It's been really lovely.
And, this is something that's really central to IDRA's work, to the EAC South. So if you're in a place, I'm getting to the last slide where it's got all of our information so you all can have it, although I'm sure you have it already. There we are. Feel free to follow up with us. And, we want to be of support to you all as you all are doing this work, either creating restorative practices or finding different ways to work on policy around discipline. All of those things we think are vitally important, and we want to be a resource to you. So please do not please not hesitate to reach out to us if we can be of assistance to you.